thing that I like to do now is I like to try to reflect on this problem of war out of the Catholic tradition. In order to do that, I would like to first of all make a point that was made in the movie, at the end of the movie, just so that we are very, very clear. And that is that in the movie, at the end of the movie, it said that imagine bombs 2,500 times this size exploding one place at one time. It is not 2,500%. It is 2,500 times 100%. That's what we're talking about as far as destruction. To tell you, to communicate to you what that means in terms of power, destructive power, during the Vietnam War, between 1965 and 1972, there was the equivalent of one Hiroshima bomb dropped on Vietnam each week. Excuse me. One each week. That was the equivalent firepower. We are no longer in the world of atomic weapons. We are in the world of thermonuclear weapons. The difference is this. If you took all the bombs dropped on Vietnam every day between 1965 and 1972, it equals one thermonuclear weapon. We are talking about a capacity for destruction that is beyond human comprehension. It takes 4 Hiroshima bombs just to detonate a thermonuclear weapon. There is no way that the human imagination can grasp what is being talked about in terms of destruction. And therefore, any talk of war, modern war, that simply ignores this reality is simply talking about a fantasy. We are not in the world of clubs and spears. To be in communion with the Catholic Church, as is the case with most other churches, major denominations, there are 2 possible ethical positions that one may assume in relationship to war. The first of these positions is the Pacific tradition of the Church, or the nonviolent tradition. This is the 2,000-year-old tradition, and basically what it says is that I cannot picture Christ being involved in the destruction of people, using flamethrowers, blowing people's heads off, burning people, and so forth. And therefore, since I cannot picture Christ doing it, I cannot imitate Christ by doing it, I cannot love as Christ loves by doing it, therefore I simply do not participate in war. Clear enough. The other tradition that's available is the non-Pacific tradition, sometimes called the just war tradition. This position is 1,700 years old. The just war tradition is not a tradition to justify war. St. Augustine is the originator, the composer, the author of the just war theory. St. Augustine is in the 5th century. The Church is 5 centuries old before we get a just war theory. St. Augustine formulates the theory and explicitly says, this is not a theory to justify war. This is a theory that if war is ever to be justified for the Christian, the war must meet every one of these standards. If the war does not meet these standards, then the war is unjust, the killing in it is unjust, and unjust killing is murder, and the Christian may not participate. Beyond that, even St. Augustine says, in the same place that he talks about the just war theory, says explicitly, this is not a theory to govern interpersonal relationships. Violence for personal self-defense remains totally prohibited for Augustine. He says explicitly, in matters of interpersonal relations, the Christian must continue to imitate his or her Savior. No use of violence. This is a theory of state. Now, I think I will just say parenthetically, before we begin, I do not see where Jesus says anything, absolutely anywhere, that a Christian can act differently in a crowd than he or she can act alone. Just because Christians group together or group with other people, it seems to me, does not relieve the Christian of loving as Christ loved. What a Christian cannot do alone, it doesn't seem to me a Christian can do in a crowd. At least I can't find any teaching like that in the New Testament. Back to the just war theory. The four standards of the just war theory, which must be met in order for the war to be just, and this is all there is in the Catholic Church. If these standards are not met, the Christian cannot participate. Period. The Catholic cannot participate. And the same holds true for most of the other churches that are historical Christian churches. The first of the standards is the war must be justly instituted. That is, whatever mechanism a society has for instituting war must be employed before that society is involved in mass slaughter, which is what war is. Only rational. You cannot arbitrarily involve your society in war. For example, in the Second World War, in the United States, war is declared by Congress, by an act of Congress. On December 7, 1941, Congress declares war after the bombing of Hiroshima, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Congress declares war. This standard is met. Absolutely, clearly, unequivocally. As Augustine says, it must be met outrightly and straightforwardly. But in terms of the Vietnam War, it is not met. And I am still waiting to hear how Catholics could have participated. The war was never declared. And if the mechanism is in use that is in the society to declare war, if the politicians are afraid to use it, what right do they have to call upon people to kill? But silence, silence. Hardly ever raised by those who are in positions to raise the issue. And they all knew it. Second standard. The war has to have a just cause. And of course, at this point here, we could say, what cause isn't just? Whose ever ox is being gored, that party will say, my cause is just. True enough. True enough. However, in the entire 1700-year history of the just war theory, there is only one cause that has been articulated as just. And that is, the war must be defensive. The party that starts war is wrong. There is no theory, just war theory, of offensive just war. It must be defensive. St. Augustine explicitly says he only sees one party to the conflict being involved in a just war. for one party has to start it, and that one is not involved in a just war. At most, it is one party. The reality is that no so-called Christian nation has ever declared the war of its own society unjust while the war was going on. So that all wars in the 1700-year history of Christianity being engaged in them have not only been just, they have been doubly just. John Courtney Murray, major Catholic theologian of the 20th century, talks about war, modern war, being marginal morality, almost impossible to justify using just war standards. Indeed, when one takes a look at the fact that no war has ever been declared unjust by its own society, one wonders if we have indeed a theological theory that is simply fantasy. That is, it's literally inapplicable to the actual human situation, because it has never been applied in 1700 years by the nation who is involved in war. Of course, all the others, they're pointing the fingers. The other side is saying, you are not involved in a just war. And who are we saying simply are not applying it? The Christian leadership is not applying it. And of course, if the Christian leadership isn't applying it, the Christians at the grassroots level aren't applying it. It has not been applied. John Courtney Murray refers to modern war as marginal morality, almost impossible to justify. On the other hand, we have another way of approaching this just cause dimension of the just war theory, and that is through the Protestant theologian Paul Ramsey. Knowing that the history of the just war theory is that it must be exclusively a defensive war, Ramsey says, a defensive war, and by the way, many theologians, both Catholic and Protestant, who are involved in just war theory are trying to make this part of the traditional just war theory, and it has never been. But they are working at it. Ramsey says, defensive war does not necessarily mean that you cannot take or make the first offensive move. If you make the first offensive move in response to an offensive move that the other side would have made, if you had given the other side the opportunity to make it, and if you are reasonably sure of this, you are engaged in a defensive war. The understanding, though, is, it's very clear, isn't it? The war must be defensive. That's what all the work is all about. Because there's never been an offensive just war. And so, it's just important to keep in mind. All societies at all times say that they are involved in a defensive war. No society says it's starting war. We are defending the fatherland, democracy, Christianity, communism, capitalism, proletariat, the people. Right, go on and on. Everyone says they're involved in a defensive war, because everyone knows how evil it is to start war. And no one wants that responsibility. And of course, the winners, the victors, always write history. And the victors always compose history that they were acting defensively. What good that does the dead is questionable. Beyond that, the problem is that we are talking about The only other theory that allows Christians to participate in war outside of, the only other theory Christians have to deal with the moral problem of war outside of pacifism. Consider, what does Cicero say is the first casualty of war? The first casualty of war, says Cicero, is truth. The minute war is on the horizon, the propaganda starts. To know whether the cause is defensive or offensive, whether it's just or not, you must have information. How do you get information under these circumstances when the whole national mechanism is geared to lying in order to mobilize against the enemy? Once again, how do you apply the theory in reality, even if it works out theologically? Third standard. Augustine says, for the war to be just, and therefore the Christian to be able to engage in it, must use just means. The means must be just. This is this moral theory of proportionality. The evil that you're doing can't be greater than the evil you're preventing. So, for example, under the justified violence theory, you may be able, if a child knocks a glass off the table, you may be able to slap its hand. You can't cut off its arm. Why? Because the evil you are now doing is greater than the evil you're preventing. And so the question becomes, in particular, a very serious question. Precisely how does the individual measure the evil of war? Precisely how does one measure, for example, the evil that was prevented in terms of that war in Vietnam versus the evil that would have occurred if the war had never taken place? All the maiming, all the destruction of American and Vietnamese people, all the burning of children, all the burning of people, all the drug addiction, all the misery to families in terms of alcoholism, people maimed in body, soul, and spirit on both sides, carried over a 15-year period. How do you calculate that ahead of time before you start war, as against what would have been the evil if that had never taken place? Where does the human being get the scale to do that with? The ruler, the measuring stick. It's one thing to talk about knocking a glass off the table and not cutting off an arm. Just means. Just means. It has always been part of the just means standard of the just war theory that the only people who are to be killed in war are combatants. Combatants. 1,700 years of consistent teaching. Combatants are to be killed. Non-combatants, civilians, are not to be attacked in war. In the First World War, 9 million people, 9 million people died. It was the first technological war. If you take a look at the movies in the First World War, you will see at the beginning of the war, you will see literally cannons being dragged by horses and donkeys. And by the end of the war, you've got tanks, you've got planes with bombs, you've got the modern mechanized technological army destroying. 9 million people dead, of whom 5% were civilians. And the world was outraged. Never before had so many civilians been destroyed in war. outraged. It was to be the war to end all wars. In the Second World War, 52 million people died. 52 million people like you and I died, of which 48% were civilians. And as you know, it is the public policy of this society, of England, of France, of Russia, of China. Nuclear weapons are primarily aimed at population centers. The public policy that the weapons are aimed at civilians. And so, what we have in terms of the just means standard of the just war theory, at least in terms of Catholic theology, is this: that in the Second Vatican Council, there is only one condemnation of an act as intrinsically evil. And that condemnation occurs in Section 80 of Church in the Modern World, and it relates to the just means standard of the just war theory. And it says, this Holy Synod makes the following condemnation its own: the indiscriminate destruction of large areas of land and civilian populations is a crime against God and humanity, and merits our unhesitating and unequivocal condemnation. What else can nuclear weapons do but destroy indiscriminately? How is it possible for Catholics to continue to support a policy of nuclear weapons aimed at population centers? I don't mean one or two. I don't mean the Berrigans or a few people at Catholic worker houses. I mean the local parish, simply sitting on its hands in the face of a document from a Vatican Council that says indiscriminate destruction of civilians is a crime against God and humanity and intrinsically evil, like abortion, intrinsically evil. Flies in the face of an entire 1700-year history of a just war theory that forbids the destruction of non-combatants. And as public policy, we have nuclear, thermonuclear weapons aimed at civilians. In other words, how can the Catholic be anything but, all Catholics, not just pacifists, but just war Catholics, how can the Catholic be anything but a nuclear pacifist? If the indiscriminate destruction of civilians is intrinsically evil, that is, nothing that could ever happen on earth could ever justify it. That's what intrinsically evil means. Just means. Just means. Where does the calculus come from? The reality is, and you and I know it as sure as we're sitting here, no one cares about civilians anymore. Simply don't care. Any place around the world, civilians are fair play. And we cannot use the argument, but civilians are part of the war machine. They make the technology, they make the bullets, and so forth and so on. Augustine knew that. He knew that there were people who were making the swords, supplying the food and so forth. And the church has known that for 1700 years. But the teaching is it's the combatants who are involved in war, not the non-combatants. And the war must be fought and limited to them. There always has to be backup personnel. Combatants is the word. But we've reached the point where civilian destruction is not even any longer a standard of the just war theories to be applied. Civilian destruction is public policy. Indeed, public policy supported by Catholics. The Secretary of State is a Catholic who supports it. Can a Catholic publicly support abortion? What's the difference? Both acts are intrinsically evil. Serious business. Serious business. Why? Because the only other theory, moral theory, that the church possesses outside of total pacifism is the just war theory. And if the church is not going to apply one of these two, then the church has utterly abdicated its moral responsibility in this world in relationship to what Thomas Merton refers to as the greatest moral problem of the second half of the 20th century, modern war. How many Christians, how many Catholics or Christians of other denominations do you know who know the standards of the just war theory? Not a handful. Why? Is it not part of universal Catholic teaching? Christian, you bet it is. But why isn't it taught? Does it make it easier or harder for the state to engage in mass slaughter if there is no universal standard that the people that it is going to call upon to do the killing and to pay for the killing have to apply? Do most Catholics, Christians, whether in France or Italy or Greece or United States or wherever they are, have nothing more for a standard for whether to enter the war or not than that their country has declared it? Because if they don't have one of these two, they have nothing that's Christian, because this is all there is. The final standard that Augustine has in the just war theory, unequivocally stated, is that every act of war, every act of killing in war, every act, bar none, no exception, every act of killing in war and the war itself must be conducted in love. And Augustine is theologically correct. For if faith without love is worthless, if martyrdom without love is worthless, if social service without love is worthless, if prophecy without love is worthless, if oratory without love is worthless, if knowledge without love is worthless, we can be sure war without love is worthless. He is presenting a theory that is theologically correct. The question is it psychologically applicable in real human life? If someone and you have a machine gun in your hand and 10 people come around that corner up there and they are out to kill you, is your heart full of the love of Christ for them? Augustine is serious. He is deadly serious. The act must be an act of love. And he means Christian love. And this gets us to the heart of the matter. The just war theory, as I started out saying, is not a theory to justify war. It is that only if these four standards are met can the Christian participate in war. Brian Hare, Father Brian Hare, who is the Executive Director of the United States Catholic Council Division of World Peace and Justice, says it this way. The Catholic Church's presumption is always a presumption of pacifism. This is where every Catholic starts. This is what he or she must prove if he or she wants to engage in war. The presumption is against participation in mass slaughter. Of course it is. Of course it is. And the only way out of the presumption, if you should want to get out, is if these standards are met. But how can you apply what you don't know? How many Catholic schools from grammar school or Lutheran schools, or Methodist schools, because this is it. Teach the just war by Augustine and the Pacific ethic as something that has to be worked with operationally and so forth. So people will know it, it will be on the tip of their tongues. How many churches have set up, if truth is the first casualty of war, how many churches have set up mechanisms that if there is a war atmosphere, they have a way of getting this kind of information to their communion, to their people, independent of the propaganda agents of the mass media and so forth? Why not? How is a Christian supposed to get the information on what's the cause of the war, what means are being used? If a Catholic man or woman enters the military, and the same thing holds true for other purposes, but I use Catholic just out of certain kind of ecumenical etiquette, I guess. If a Catholic man or woman, I shouldn't say man or woman, huh? Children. I'm not being chauvinistic, but the truth of the matter is someone at 18, 19 years old coming out of high school, faced with the Pentagon juggernaut, is a child. This is hundreds of billions of dollars going in with years and years and decades of knowing how to manipulate people, walking into a situation which we'll see in a minute. 19 years old. When that person walks in and joins the military, what assurances, in light of the Vatican II statement that calls indiscriminate destruction of civilians intrinsically evil, totally condemned, what assurances is the church procuring from the military that no one in its communion will ever have to be in the chain of preparing, executing, putting in place nuclear weapons? Any? None. Why not? Is it such an arbitrary matter or such a trivial piece of morality? And finally, it's an elementary principle of ethics that a person cannot pay for another person to do an evil that he or she cannot do him or herself. A person cannot pay for another to do an evil that they can't do. For example, if I'm walking down the corridor out here and I hear 6 gunshots ring out, and I walk in the room and here's a man with a smoking gun, 6 people are dead on the floor. And I see 6 more people chained to the wall, and I say, "What did you do?" He said, "I killed them." I said, "That's murder." He says, "I know." He says, "That's fine." I say, "You can't do that. That's murder. That's not what Christ wants of us, God wants of us." He says, "Yeah, I know." I said, "But look, I'm out of bullets. Could you give me a couple bucks? I got to get these 6. Can I give him the money? If I know that the intention is to do something that I consider intrinsically evil, how can I pay for it? And therefore, it's not merely a problem for 18-year-olds. For the question becomes, even under the just war, and certainly under the past, how can a Catholic Christian pay for nuclear war, its preparation or its execution? Same question. How can a Catholic Christian pay for abortion? How can I pay to have others do an evil that I can't do myself? But the answer is, if I don't dish up the taxes, the IRS will hurt me. They'll attach my salary. They may attach my house. Fair enough. But where does it say in the gospel that one is relieved from doing one's Christian duty because one fears the consequences of doing one's Christian duty? Serious, serious business. There is a church-state conflict. two separate and distinct behaviors are being asked for. One is asking people to pay for what we just saw on the screen. Only 2,500 times over times 30,000 bombs being made at the rate of 3 a day. One is asking for the money to carry that out, and the other is saying no. Civilian destruction, and we're talking just war theory now, not pacifism. Civilian destruction is intrinsically evil. The one has a public policy that its nuclear weapons are aimed at civilian population centers, and the other says civilian destruction is evil. And so, it becomes a very, very serious moral moment in time for Christians. For what is it that indeed we are going to do? Caesar or Christ? Because not the same thing is being asked for. Even being asked for, not on the pacifist side of things, but even under the just war theory. It's interesting, you probably, I read this to you, paper, a few days ago. Sidney Harris was saying, on Armistice Day, he says, all nations are in a state of war or potential war all the time. No war has ever really ended. At most, it has been postponed, carried over to the next generation or two, adjourned until some new weapons can be devised or some new pretext can be found for resuming hostilities. There is hardly a year of recorded history without war. And the conflict that we observe today with an armistice, namely the First World War, the conflict that we observe today with an armistice was heralded at the time as the war to end all wars, First World War. That is what President Woodrow Wilson told us the day he declared war, using this slogan as the justification for embroiling us in mass slaughter. Few Americans today know the reason Wilson and his fellow patriots gave for going to fight against the Germans. Wilson explicitly said that he had to declare war against the Kaiser because the Kaiser had instituted peacetime conscription. Think about it. And he had to put an end to this arcane, militaristic wickedness. What would be good now is if we, in your packets, there is an article, if we could take just 5 minutes to read it, by Gordon Zahn, entitled Social Science and the Theology of War. When you read it, the question to ask yourself is this an accurate description of what it describes? And if it is, how can Christians participate? So we'll take 5 minutes to read that, and if you don't have any articles, there's some in here. Right. Massachusetts, Catholic man. The topic sentence, military planners operate on the basis of military expediency. And individual soldiers are trained to operate on the basis of unquestioning obedience to military superiors. What's war all about? The definition of war is the resolution of inter- or intranational conflict by the means of the prosecution of mass suffering and death. Military expediency is a euphemism for being able to cause suffering and death efficiently. That's what it is. Military planners do not sit with the gospel in front of them figuring out what it is what Jesus would do. The technology of war and the operation of war is that the winner is the one who can kill and maim most efficiently. That's what the nature of it is. And indeed, therefore, the whole structure of military training, of military life, of what war is, what the military is all about, is preparation of people to participate in mass slaughter and mass maiming. In the third paragraph it says, the beginning of the third paragraph, the military training program is crucial to the argument, in that it may be seen as a set of social controls designed to subject the individual trainee to a process of systematic depersonalization and the increase, in the interest of increased military efficiency. Meaning what? Meaning the process of military training is the process of handing over your moral life to another person. That when he says kill, you will kill. When he says jump, you will jump. Go into the Marine Corps. These are college graduates now. People who graduated with me from Notre Dame. Go in the Marine Corps, 21 years old, 4 years of college behind you. Go into officers training in the Marine Corps. You're at boot camp 2 days, and they have you up at 3 o'clock in the morning, brushing perfectly clean floors with a toothbrush. Would you do that? If I said to you now, here, take a toothbrush and clean this floor, would you do that? You bet you would. What do you say, crazy? Well, why is it done there? Fear. The chain of command is a chain of fear. And people do it because they fear not to do it. And people are made to do the irrational. Because once you can get them to do the irrational, to wash floors at 3 o'clock in the morning with the toothbrush, you're just one step away from having total control over them. You've got them. From the moment you step off the bus, you're yelled and screamed at. The atmosphere is one of fear. It is not courage that's produced, it is cowardice. The inability to stand up and say, you don't have to yell at me, I'm a human being. The inability to stand up and say, this floor is clean. That's cowardice. The inability to stand up and say rational sentences. Toothbrushes are for brushing teeth. Cowards. The nurturing of cowards. Not men. That is not courageous men. People who are afraid to function and any other way but the way they're ordered under the chain of command, which is a chain of fear. Indeed, as Zahn points out, this is the building of men. But what kind of men? In deadly seriousness, I ask you, does this process appear to you, that's described in this essay, does this process of military training appear to you to be a process that is nurturing the mind of Christ? And if it is not, how can you allow your children, how can the Christian community allow its children to enter into it? You know what they teach you? They teach you how to stick daggers in people's stomachs. Is that what Christ would teach his disciples? They teach you 8 different ways to kick people in the groin. Is that what Christ would teach his disciples? They teach you how to pull out eyes. Is that what Christ would teach his disciples? And they teach it all with an emotion. So that it will become second nature to you. So that indeed you will obey and command. That you'll do it in the crowd. Who do you think? Think about this. Read you something. As military slaves, young men are dressed up in costumes and subjected to intensified methods of stupefaction and brutalization. This stupefaction and brutalization is accomplished by educating children in the savage superstitions of patriotism and then taking them at a youthful age, when they have not yet had time to form any firm convictions in regard to morality, and then removing them from all natural conditions of human life, from home, from family, from friends, from native district, from rational labor, and then locking them up together in narrow barracks, dressing them up in peculiar garments, and making them under the influences of shouts and drums and music and glittering objects perform daily exercises specially invented to teach them how to kill. Thus, they become unthinking machines which are obedient to the commands of their hypnotizers. These hypnotized, physically strong young men who are obedient to the power of the agents of government and who are prepared to commit any act at their command, these machines are then provided with the instruments of murder. These young men, very frequently learned young men who have studied all the sciences and arts in the university, now all express their readiness to dress up in fool's attire, to jump, to contort their bodies, to bow, to kill, provided only that they are commanded by a man who is clad in a pretty red livery embroidered with gold. Let these young men be killed by the thousands, by the millions. Let them be torn to pieces while the generals and the politicians live in luxury. They will nonetheless go to slaughter like senseless cattle. And having submitted to this process of stupefaction and brutalization and all the humility and degradation that goes with it, the young men may, if they are not killed, receive red, gold, tinfoil decorations to put on their fool's garments. And one or two of them may someday command hundreds or thousands of just such bestialized men as himself and be called a field marshal and receive a lot of money. However, most who are left alive will briskly return to civilian life, to imaginary participation in government, and to talk about such noble subjects as man's dignity, Jesus Christ, and freedom. You know who wrote that? Tolstoy, 100 years ago. Kingdom of God is within you. I believe. I've read most of his stuff. I believe this is from there. Is it so hard to understand what we're involved with? Is it so hard to get a larger picture on what the issue is and what's at stake? to have a sense of history that's larger than simply the moment of patriotism, to have a sense of religion that's Catholic and not nationalistic. Let me conclude with this. It is not just 18-year-olds who are participating. It is 25-year-olds and 55-year-olds who are participating by paying for the mechanisms of war, by paying for the mechanisms of brutalization, by paying for the mechanisms that do not nurture the mind of Christ, but nurture something else altogether. Paying for their own destruction and the destruction of their children, paying for what is contrary to the will of God. Lanza del Vasta was a disciple of Gandhi, Catholic man, died this year in January at 80 years old, founded a community in France called the Community of the Ark, nonviolent Christian community. Has this in one of his writings. He says, "Once I had a dream of a lamb who was standing by a rotating stone on which he was sharpening a butcher knife. I said to the lamb, 'Why are you sharpening a knife?' The lamb said, 'Because I am being paid to do so.' I said to the lamb, 'But don't you know that they are going to use the knife to cut your throat?' 'Yes,' said the lamb. 'Well,' I said, 'why do you continue to sharpen the knife?' The lamb said, 'One must make a living somehow.'" During the Vietnam War, there were buttons that read, "Don't knock the war that feeds your family." Don't knock the war that feeds your family. Most of the people that we probably know are somehow directly tied in to the military process, through jobs, through industry. What's at stake is awfully serious. For I am sure that every person that puts every bolt in every tank, that puts every piece of wire in every computer, that goes to send nuclear and conventional weapons to destruction, that every person after the Holocaust involved in this, every person that has paid every penny in taxes in order to train people to kill, in order to produce the technology to kill, when the Holocaust occurs, will say, "I am not responsible. I am not responsible." Is Christian morality such a thing? Is Christian morality such a thing that right becomes wrong simply because the majority say right is wrong? Or is Christian morality tied intimately into the willingness to stand up and speak out clearly and say with one's words and with one's life, evil is evil? The preparation and the execution of mass slaughter is evil. I will not participate. is it so unclear what's being talked about. Here is a letter from I.A. Toff and Sons, manufacturers of heating equipment, to the Commandant of Auschwitz concerning the new heating system. Quote, "We acknowledge the receipt of your order for 5 triple furnaces, including 2 electric elevators for raising the corpses and 1 emergency elevator. For putting the bodies into the furnace, we suggest simply a metal fork moving on cylinders. For transporting the corpses, we suggest using light carts on wheels. We are submitting plans for our perfected cremation ovens, which operate with cold and have hitherto given you full satisfaction. We guarantee their effectiveness as well as their durability. It's very important to understand that outside of Jesus Christ, no person has been written on as much since 1945 as Hitler. Hitler had 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 hands, 1 mouth, and 2 eyes like you and I do. It required tens of millions of people living in the same spirit, most of whom were Christian, to carry out what had to be carried out. It required architects, it required people to turn screws, it required people to hitch trains together, it required people to make cement, etc., etc., etc. Merton again quoting Himmler at Auschwitz. Himmler, most of you know what it means when 100 corpses are lying side by side, or 500 or 1,000, but to have stuck it out, and at the same time, apart from understandable human weakness, to have remained decent fellows. This is what has made us great. Merton, decent indeed, but damned. Here's an article from New York Times a few years back by Anthony Lewis. Those with weak stomachs for the unpleasant should stop reading now. It is not really proper to call them people anymore. Shapes is a better word. Grotesque sculptors of scarred flesh and gnarled limbs. Years of being shackled in prison have forced them into a permanent pretzel-like crouch. They move like crabs, skidding across the floor on their buttocks and on their palms. That description in Time magazine recently was of an exceptional group of human beings, political prisoners in South Vietnam. They are exceptional because they exist. Those who go to South Vietnam's prison island rarely emerge in any living form. The Time report filed by David DeVos quoted one man as saying, he was arrested one day in the park with his wife and his children. The police attached electrodes to my genitals, broke my fingers, hung me from the ceiling by my feet. They did these things to my wife too, and they forced my children to watch. In the tiger cage cells of Con Son, water was limited to 3 swallows a day, forcing prisoners to drink their own urine in order to survive. That picture of what happens to those arrested by the Saigon government is the same as many other conscientious and unhysterical observers have given. The tiger cages were completely paid for by money, taxpayers' money, in the Food for Peace program. The tiger cages, every screw of them was put together in the state of Michigan. This is Dan Berrigan's Catonsville 9, and it's a play based on the actual transcript. And at this point in the trial, George Mishi, one of the defendants, is being questioned, and he's trying to recount the fact that he was in the Peace Corps years before, and that when he went to Latin America, people didn't accept him. And he was there trying to do good, but people were throwing rocks at him, and he couldn't understand what was happening. So he says, "We were not only not welcome now, but people were throwing bricks at us. This confused me. But after I became involved at a higher level, I started to understand why bricks were being thrown at us. I was working in two countries where coups d'etats, the military overthrow of government, had taken place. Two democratically elected governments were overthrown by the military with the Pentagon's support. At that point, I felt I could not go on in conscience with this work, because Kennedy had said we would not deal with military dictatorships. At the overthrow of democracy, he said, we would stop all military support, all economic support. We would withdraw our people to have the leaders return to democracy. Well, when I saw the opposite occur, I resigned. This reversal of things had the most impact on me in the Dominican Republic. That was such a tragedy as to be unbelievable. A man like Trujillo ran that country for 32 years. When someone dared talk, just talk about social change or social reform, they would go into his house. They would take the head of the family out of the house. They would cut off his penis, put it in his mouth, cut off his arms, cut off his legs, and drop him back in the doorway, all with the support of the Pentagon. Is it that we really don't know? The people in the movie, at the place where people really back off, is when the bulldozer is pushing the bodies into the grave. But those people are dead. And they've been dead for 35 years. But what they suffered before their death, people are suffering at this moment. The movie concludes with, you think that this happened in one place at one time. It didn't. Are you deaf to the endless cries? Thomas Merton, in Faith and Violence, writes, the theology of violence must not lose sight of the real problem of violence, which is not the individual with the revolver, but death and genocide as big business. This big business of death is all the more innocent because it involves a long chain of individuals, each of whom feels himself absolved from responsibility. We know, for instance, that Adolf Eichmann and others like him felt no guilt for their share in the extermination of the Jews. This feeling of justification was due partly to their absolute obedience to higher authority and partly to the care and efficiency which they put into the details of their work. Since they dealt with numbers and not with people, since their job was one of bureaucratic organization, they apparently could easily forget the reality of what they were cooperating in. The real problems of modern war do not occur in the rare instances of hand-to-hand combat. The real problems of modern war occur in the remote planning centers of organized technological destruction. Modern technological mass murder is no longer directly visible like individual murder. Modern technological mass murder is abstract, corporate, businesslike, cool, free of guilt feelings, and therefore 1,000 times more deadly and effective than the eruption of individual violence. It is this polite, massively organized, white-collar murder machine that threatens the world with destruction and not the violence of a few desperate teenagers in the slums. But our antiquated Christian theology myopically focuses on individual violence and does not see this. Our antiquated moral theology shudders at the phantasm of a mugging or killing on our doorstep, but it blesses and it canonizes the antiseptic violence of corporately organized murder, because corporate murder is respectable, efficient, clean, and above all, corporate murder is profitable. Finally, Albert Camus writing says, what the world expects from Christians is that they will speak out loud and clear, so that never a doubt, never the slightest doubt could arise in the heart of the simplest man or woman as to what Christianity means. The grouping of Christians that is needed in this world is a grouping of men and women resolved to speak out clearly and pay up personally for what they believe. John L. McKenzie says, it is an unequivocal part of the Judeo-Christian traditional morality that where more is expected, silence is sinful. The commandant and his wife says, in the movie, say that they don't know what's going on. And if you remember, the next question was, and who else doesn't know?